the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and I have the pleasure of hopping over to Wales to chat with Mark Jones. Mark, welcome.
Hi, Jen. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to finally have you on and get to ask you a question I've never posed before, but what was your first astrology book?
And it was amazing, even just seeing the questions you'd asked brought back a lot of recollections. And I'm torn, for honesty's sake, because I did have the Astrologer's Handbook. I've forgotten the author's, was a famous book, you know, the kind of look up the specific aspects kind of book. But I got into astrology because of a Kabbalistic astrology weekend, because I was studying mysticism, having discovered that my education didn't seem to really cover all of reality, fundamentally. Part psychedelic, part induced by meeting some genuine teachers, having, I guess, visionary experiences of my own in my own way, and realizing that life wasn't as simple. I turned to all these systems of study, and I found this Kabbalist teaching at Regent's Park College, and the weekend I chose to go was Kabbalistic Astrology.
Wow. And
his book was The Anatomy of Fate, and his name as an astrologer was Warren Kenton, but his name as a Kabbalist was Zev Ben Shimon Halevi. And he was a kind of, English guy who looked, this huge beard and was very traditional. But he had discovered all of this later in life. It turned out later. I didn't know this at the time. To me, he seemed like a combination of spiritual power and absolute tradition. And I was this fringe outsider, smoking a bit too much, having had a kind of psychedelic acceleration of my understanding, as it were, kind of in a band, mooching around London and the occult bookshops. And so it was incredibly empowering for me to discuss with him spiritual experiences I'd had. I went up in the lunch break. I just said, look, I wanted to share this main spiritual experience I had. And he was incredibly validating. He was like, that's Beriah, that's from the creative spiritual world, that world of light you saw. It's an entirely authentic experience. So it's incredibly empowering. You've got this skinny 23, 24-year-old guy looking like a stoner in London, talking to this like bearded, traditional kind of mystic teacher. And it was so empowering. And I went away with this inner image of the tree of life and the planets in my horoscope aligned with the tree. So right away, you're in this sense of the incarnational power of the chart, aren't you? You start with the earth, you go to the moon, the sun in the middle pillar of Kabbalah. You go from earth, Malkuth, to Yod, so Yesod, the moon, Yod, Mercury, Neschak, Venus, Tiferet, the sun. So you have this sense of the path that you're on. So astrology for me, right at the beginning, is linked to this idea of being on a path, and the astrology helping illuminate the nature of that path. So it's not a research thing to begin with. It could have landed from outer space as far as I'm concerned. I didn't know where it came from, other cultures' relationship to it, anything like that. It was astrology as a kind of psychic map. So the tree would be seen on one level as the path of coming into this world, like the soul traveling through the Hermetic spheres, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars coming in. So on one level, the tree would be seen as an involution. You're coming into this world, but obviously then implicit in it is your evolution.
As above, so below.
Exactly, but your growth into this world, or that your visionary growth into it. So astrology from the off for me is mired in this sort of kind of spiritual quest. And then this strange thing happens. I'm in this sort of artistic house, musicians, artists in London. And in the next week following that workshop, I go to Watkins bookstore. I buy for like £3 or something, a single sheet printout of my chart. Then I get everyone else's in the house. And then literally at the end of that week, I am the astrologer in that community. I know almost nothing before that. And almost immediately, I'm treated like this is a divine gift bestowed upon me or something. This is my role. And eventually this band house ends up moving to Wales for cost reasons, living in London. And several of the guys were from Wales. And we get to that house in Wales, and literally I'm talking one night and someone just turns around to me and says, if you mention astrology again, you're either going to teach us a class about it starting next week, or I'm going to clout you one. You're going to shut the F up about it, because you keep mentioning this thing and no one else knows what it is.
Yeah.
So I literally start an astrology class in my mid-20s for my friends. And that becomes the basis of my learning. I'm putting together then, I've gone from the Kabbalistic stuff into psychological astrology. That's led me into Jung, through Liz Greene, how it's a sportas, Stephen Arroyo, this kind of territory. So it all happens of its own, on its own in a way, by this kind of spontaneous organizing force. But the initial act of going was a massive big deal to me. I didn't go out in London like that. I certainly didn't go to fancy places like Regent's Park College and attend, this very established esoteric group. And yet it's the only time I ever went. And yet I took it away and made it my own. And many years later, strangely enough, I'm at this creative lab. Lawrence Hillman, amongst others, is working on the material for archetypes at work. And I've been invited to take part in the kind of creative lab to see how that work's going. And I meet someone at that place, and I literally have this intuition. I'm like, there's a vibe, next time I'm in London, can I get you a meal, take you out for dinner, something? I don't know. Maybe it sounded like I was coming onto this person. I don't know. But it was just this inner propulsion. And 10 minutes into the dinner, months later, when the person has figured out we're not on a date, suddenly emerges that they were part of that inner group with Warren Kenton, Zev Bon Shimon Hablevi. For 25 years, they were part of that inner circle. They were the absolute closest point to him. And this lady is able to tell me then, in the COVID era, when Warren passes away, and I am able to attend via Zoom his funeral service, stand up at this very computer and honor the man that taught me astrology as his funeral procession comes into the large church near London that it was taking place.
Wow.
Yeah. So I felt very full circle. And I think maybe she even spoke to him about me. I'm not sure. I think maybe she did. There was some kind of sense, this weird guy that came to one thing, walked away, and had his life changed. And then to stumble into someone just at the right time when I might be able to honor it full circle, literally decades later, 25 years plus later. So to me, you could say, outside of the back of Sunday papers or magazines, realizing there were sun sign columns, I had almost never heard of astrology prior to encountering it through occult or mystical studies. And so I remain an unusual astrologer in that, to me, astrology is a tool, or there's something primary, there's something prior to astrology. There is the soul's engagement with reality or the presence. And then astrology comes down a notch below that as an expression or a tool you could use to understand that.
The map of the path.
Yeah, exactly. And that's still its power now to me. You can map multiple paths, and my own work has even gone into the area of historical research or understanding how cultures or archetypes themselves grow. But still my main work is with individuals, using the chart to help them understand in heightened sessions, either short-term ongoing mentoring or one-off astrology sessions, help them understand where they are in their path and therefore how the next step might naturally evolve for them. Because that's the key to me. You don't need to understand your whole life. You don't need to go to an astrologer at 24 and have your whole life mapped out, because that would be really freaking weird, right? What you need is the next step or two. You just need the next couple of steps each time, and then increasingly trust your own evolution within that process, your own deepening within your own life path. So I'm demystifying, in one kind of way. I'm saying, yes, astrology is kind of mystical. It points to the soul's unfoldment, but I'm also saying demystify it. You're not doing one perfect astrology reading. You're using that symbolism to help someone find the next step, the next point in the path.
That's beautiful. And I'm like blushing now because I'm like, but I have looked at my whole life.
Yes. Well, and there are certain
it's tempting.
techniques.
It's tempting.
And there are certain techniques that lend themselves to that. Say, take the Time Lord type or zodiacal releasing type technique. I don't really know how to do, but I've been fortunate enough to have close friends in the profession. It's very interesting. It can identify very important periods in your life. I mean, again, you could say the limitation of turning to a 23-year-old and say, hey, when you're 54, boom,
It's going to open up for you, but sit
exactly.
tight.
Yeah. That's a long sit tight, isn't it? And then, but the other thing is to say, and I would make this argument quite profoundly, the archetypes themselves evolve. So they evolve in people's lives because people's concept of Saturn changes, for example, as they grow. But I would argue Saturn has changed culturally and historically too.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are both parents of young children. Up until the turn of the 20th century, infant mortality was so serious that 40-something% of children, even in the West, did not make it to adulthood. And now it's some ridiculously small percentage, thank God. So Saturn is different. The amount of grief a regular person would have to deal with. Darwin writing movingly about losing his favorite child, etc. These things, they're not trivial. These archetypes evolve and people evolve in relationship to them. So the chart's moving in that sense. There might be certain techniques that allow you to see abstract time frames, but the person themselves will have grown in the intervening years, so it changes.
Yeah. And the concept of responding to that pattern changes the pattern.
Yes.
One of my favorite things to think about is the way that looking can also change the past as well as the future.
Yes, this is why Ian McGilchrist, the author of The Matter with Things, or The Master and His Emissary, says that attention is basically a moral act. What you choose to pay attention to is a moral decision because of the observer effect, essentially, because you will change because of where you look.
So let's pay attention to the books you're going to pick on this deserted island that I'm sending you to.
Yes, what I want is a sun lounger.
Okay.
A margarita, which is very hard to get a good one in this country, and some sunshine, which is even harder to get in my country.
Okay, so we need to send you to like Corsica.
Exactly, and I'm lying there, I'm exposing as much of myself as is legal, right, in the given place, so I can get some sun on me.
To collect the vitamin D from the sun.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, so I picked a serious one to start with because I figured, I want a long time in the sun because I haven't seen the sun for a long time. So Cosmos and Psyche is a fairly serious read by Richard Tarnas. And it's a pretty major contribution in the sense that here you have this man, a serious academic figure, the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, risking all in his intellectual or academic reputation to produce, not a technical astrology book, but a big picture astrology book using outer planet cycles to map historical epochs. So hardly imprecise technical type astrology, but still a philosophical attempt to engage with an astrological worldview as something that could be understood on a serious level to offer insight into historical patterns. That's a non-trivial thing, and I'm sure that man took a kicking for it in some arenas. I'm sure there was some academic blowback about that. Sure. It's not without personal risk in a way in terms of his reputation. I wanted to honor that act of seriousness as much as anything. It's an act of gratitude to take our slightly shaky profession seriously, to elevate it through a kind of grand intellectual vision, if you like, or, systemic study, but that was a sensitive enough study that it also included bigger cultural movements or, trying to define the Romantic era or something like that. So I really appreciated that. I mean, I could have picked, say, Nicholas Campion's Book of World Horoscopes. That would be the technical parallel to it. When I wrote the Planetary Node book, other than a short pamphlet by Rudhyar on the nodes, the two big uses were Cosmos and Psyche and Campion's Book of World Horoscopes.
That would be a really cool sports competition.
Yes.
In your mind, between the two of them, you've got
Exactly.
Nick running here with data, and you've got Tarnas over here with the conceptual framework kind of coming together in your notebook.
Yes, Campion with this incredible level of research to give you the actual origin charts that you can actually use as a point of departure for study. Enormous contribution. Really formed the basis of lots of the historical type research in the Planetary notebook. But, of course, without Tarnas's big picture view, you get lost in the details, don't you? So it's this, I think that is a great competition. I think those two forces would actually come together in a better world where two opposing forces actually combine to make something better instead of the fractured falling away that we often see, say, politically, culturally, or in a kind of creative union, those two would work together. And in fact, that's how me and my researcher, Patrick Graham, actually use them. Mainly the Book of World Horoscopes, but the Cosmos and Psyche level had shaped my understanding before, and then I fitted it to what Rudhyar was looking at in the latter years of his life.
Hearing you speak is making something shift in my own mind around there's a before and an after to Cosmos and Psyche being published. And it's been published for so long now and has influenced so many people who are not necessarily practitioners of astrology, but who through that text have gained an appreciation for it, that we don't remember when it didn't exist. And when that archetypal patterning wasn't so obvious.
Whereas I do remember, I'm old enough to remember. And whilst astrology is still somewhat fringe and prone to all sorts of issues from that, it's not as fringe as it was in, say, the 1980s or 90s, or just like only in occult bookstores, or there are only a handful of bookstores in the UK that really cover it kind of territory. And weird little groups, maybe affiliates of the Theosophical Society or something like that, where you go and meet in some strange back room in London or whatever. There's not a lot going on outside of London in a country like the UK. Maybe little societies here and there. I'm not trying to rule anyone out, but the internet changed everything. And I think Cosmos and Psyche did change everything in terms of it represented some kind of icebreaker, like those ships that get through the first part of sea ice. It took us into a new Bering Strait where intellectually someone of some genuine degree of pedigree or caliber had taken it seriously on that level. I mean, in the psychological sphere, someone like Liz Greene has brought a similar kind of clarity of thought and writing to it. She's clearly made an exceptional contribution. I mean, I couldn't literally just pick out one of her books. I'd have had to have just said the whole vibe she gives me over her entire career is just that she brought this seriousness and sort of analyst insight to the whole process. Whereas Tarnas, it gets encapsulated in that one thing. There's a shorter book, Prometheus the Awakener, about the Uranus archetype, but it's nowhere near the kind of contribution that Cosmos and Psyche is, which is a genuine big style attempt. I mean, look, what are the flawed? I mean, people could disagree with parts of his thesis. Certainly it's not presenting an astrological methodology. And you could argue that the archetypal astrology that it went on to partly found sometimes doesn't have the strongest methodology. But the richness they're bringing from looking at astrology like that to the cultural narrative is amazing,
Right. Well, and it helps inform times like the most recent 5 years of apparent uncertainty and contextualize it in something that is actually not uncertain, but it's difficult to face that unless you have a different framework.
Yes. Well, and that's the power. What you just said, isn't it? That's where you and I could really align in what we think the important archetypal or divinatory power of astrology actually is. To be informed of the archetypal potentials is to realize what we might have to face through certain transits or in certain periods of growth. If you've really addressed the concept of maturation, is a Saturn transit the same level of fear? If you've really addressed your commitment to transform and heal, is a Pluto transit the same level of fear that it would be for some? They ask something of you. And I think that's part of the information download of astrology. It's not just linear information about options. It's a deeper archetypal encounter with the meanings and boundaries of a human life, really.
Well, and going back to what you said earlier, though, is if you are already in that soup and you know in advance of something happening, let's say 4 years ahead, That's not a couple steps ahead, so that even when it arrives, and I'm speaking about a certain thing that was happening in my own chart, it's like the lived experience of going through it was very different than the knowing about it.
Yes. I mean, becoming a parent, which happened to both of us, within the reasonable last period of time. People tell you all sorts, don't they? There's those people who think they're helping you by giving you the sort of doom list and how you'll be reduced and near destroyed as a person.
Yeah.
And then there are others going, it's great, but, think about this and think about that. And then it happens to you, and it is, at some difficult moments as bad as people said it would be. And yet it's stunningly better than people said it ever could be, because I don't think people even know how to convey that level of meaning anymore. And so you literally can't know that unless it's happened to you.
Right.
It's the most obvious example, isn't it? People will be listening to this knowing exactly what I mean because they're a parent, and people will be listening who aren't, and they might tell themselves they know what I mean, but they don't. And it's not something I say that often. I mean, that can sound aggressive. I'm not trying to shut people out here.
There's also a parallel, and I would say that is a different kind of transformational experience, which is grief.
Mm.
It's a threshold. If you've lost someone close and you're grieving and you know grief, then you're in a different caliber of human experience than if you haven't had that happen yet.
There was an old professor called Peter Russell. He was a British poet, but he was a professor at an Italian university. And I saw him lecture, this enormous beard stained with all the roll-ups that he smoked. There's this brown thing down this grey beard. And he gave this he was an incredibly learned man. And he gave this talk. But the essence of the talk was, unless your heart had been broken, you could not be a poet.
Mm.
Your encounter with the world would not be sensitive enough to take into account the real gravitas of this world. And he gave this super intellectual but also deeply passionate speech, this strange, if you don't like roll-ups, slightly grubby figure of a shabby old professor on a podium. And yet it was such a poignant and beautiful talk. And I couldn't help but agree with him. And if you look at, say, someone like Rilke, his letters to a young poet or his letters on grief, I mean, it's just the opening, isn't it, to the world, the crack that lets the light in.
Yeah. But you wouldn't want to necessarily wish it on anyone either.
Christ, no. Well,
So,
think of your own child. Think of your own child, like your love for your child. You want to protect them from that.
Yeah.
And yet you can't protect them from that, can you? Because it's coming and it will enrich them when it comes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yet you wouldn't want it to come sooner than it had to.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show.
What else did I have? I mean, the Rudhyar book, From Humanistic to Transpersonal Astrology. And this is a very slim book. And I think the vast majority, possibly all of it, is listed for free on chaldea.com.
Is that because Rudhyar's in the public domain now?
Well, it's because there's that very excellent online archive of his stuff, Chaldea, KHALDEA.com. So why, I'll just provide some context because the therapist in me immediately understood the context as soon as you see the title. There's a series of movements perceived in psychology. So you have like behaviorism, then psychoanalysis, then you have the kind of third wave humanistic psychology, and then this shift towards a transpersonal dialogue, like someone like Stanislav Grof, who worked with Tarnas, or other figures. Where does psychology stand on the whole idea of greater states of consciousness beyond the self? So when he writes From Humanistic to Transpersonal Astrology, he's echoing a third to fourth wave shift in psychology. So he's mirroring the growth of psychology in the latter part of the 20th century, and he's applying it to astrology. I would just say to people, read this short pamphlet, even if you disagree, because it's just full of the most choice quotes and ideas. Astrology is the most fertile ground for the growth of unsubstantiated personal opinion masquerading as fact. That's one genius line from it. So he raises, to counter that, the whole idea of statistical analysis in astrology. And then he goes, well, that's helpful, but statistics is a limit too, because facts have no relationship to meaning outside the consciousness that perceives those facts. So he makes this other huge revelatory step towards the subjectivity of experience and how understanding is going to happen. And you could say that's interesting astrologically on a number of levels. Let's say you see the period coming up. Do you even say? I mean, how do you say? Is the person even ready to receive that? So Rudhyar raises so many things in a short space of time, including profound critiques of astrology, but also genuinely visionary statements about its potential, that I just think this was the one I weighed up against the Liz Greene oeuvre, or something like Stephen Arayo's Karma, Fate, Astrology and Transformation, which I loved in my 20s. But the reason I picked it is because when I was reading it, I genuinely now, there were points where I thought I could have written that myself. I agree with this so profoundly, and I would have put that in such a similar way. I mean, maybe not Rudhyar's style, because he's this mad, abstract Aries kind of mind, and I'm not like that. It's just the closest thing I've read to my vision in some ways of the kind of meaning or how to hold or utilize astrology.
Right. Because you've seen so many people over such an extended period of time. I'm hearing you say it was like Rudhyar's pamphlet was narrating what your experience had been.
Yes. And you see, the unusual thing is it's not just that those people I've seen, I haven't just seen thousands of people for readings, although I have. I've also had the other experience where I've seen one person 1,000 times.
That's what I mean.
As a therapist, and had
over
their chart.
Yeah.
So I've had both. I've had incredible depth with a small number of people over time, and then several thousand one-off encounters or short-term encounters using the chart. And that's allowed me to have this sort of contemplative range. What do I think's really going on? What ought we be trying to achieve? What's actually most effective for people in those sessions? And I would make the broad point that the fantasy that we can read an entire chart is an eternalism. It's a Platonic fantasy. The Buddha critiqued two stances: nihilism, obviously, and eternalism. We'll hold on to it, this one perfect self forever. And that's the fantasy with the astrology reading. Like, it's as if the person that comes to us is ageless. Whereas actually reading a chart for a 28-year-old and reading a chart for a 78-year-old is completely different, right?
Yeah,
they're in completely different relationship to how they've lived this symbolism.
Well, and it's a natal chart, not an ongoing chart, which is why we have timing techniques that would allow us to see progressions on various scales and such. But whenever I'm teaching, I always like to say, are you born with a full set of adult teeth? And everybody's like, no, that's horrific. Why would you see? Oh, that's like an image you just can't get out of your head. I'm like, your chart is where you start, not where you finish. So we're not looking at, we have to look at the whole thing in a developmental structure.
I love that. I couldn't agree more.
But so many new people see their chart and they're looking at a picture of a baby with adult teeth. And it's like, we gotta break that image. We got to look at it from a different cycles pattern.
Or they're looking at what is effectively a spiritual fantasy. People will say, what's my life's purpose? Or how does my chart show me what I'm supposed to do? But you've got to engage with that work of engagement with the symbolisms. Your life, there isn't a simple answer to the meaning of life. It's not 42, like from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, It's discovered through living it. It's discovered through the unfoldment of your engagement with it. Yeah.
And it changes.
Yeah, exactly. Because your engagement with it changes. And that's why I would argue astrology readings change over time, and that's not trivial. And the idea that you could exhaust the profound symbolism of a natal chart in even a reading that took all day, an 8-hour reading as a one-off eternal reading, is just a fantasy to me. So I think Rudhyar raises a lot of points in a very short space of time. He's such a strange writer because I've read whole long books of his and thought there's very little content. And then I read a short pamphlet and I just think, wow, this is so much content. You could just keep digesting this, metabolizing this for years and years and years.
Let's go back just before we leave Rudhyar on that point. In my own work here at CAELi, I've been looking a lot at the humanistic astrology, especially the way Michael Meyer distills. That was one of my picks on my desert island, was the Handbook for Humanistic Astrology. So
Yes.
From your vantage point now, do you think that there is a utility for humanistic astrology, or does
Yes,
this pamphlet
absolutely.
from Rudhyar push us into a more transpersonal
No,
perspective?
well, because he's honoring both. I think
Okay.
he is a proponent and supporter of both third and fourth wave psychology. So humanistic principles become the portal to grounded spiritual principles. Without, say, an existential domain, spirituality tends to bypass. Without the recognition of our fragility and our mortality, spirituality tends to go off into the range of ascension and, flying on crystal rainbows. It's a bit like my 6-year-old daughter's fantasy of what spirituality would be. Crystal unicorn rides across the galaxy, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's cool, but it's not the answer to life, right? So humanistic, I think, is the grounding to lots of transpersonal themes, because humanistic basically says, locate it in now and your present sense of agency. And I think that is critical, because there's been this huge tendency around various splits in our culture and our psyche that a spiritual perspective actually becomes damaging to people, strangely, sadly, because it's disconnected from that sense of agency or that sense of the present moment growth. That's why I love that title of that book by Pema Chodron, Start Where You Are. I've never read the book. I just think it's a brilliant title, because you do have to start where you are. And so humanistic psychology and astrology, I think, grounds the potential for the transpersonal. Then you're not forcing the transpersonal. I'm not opening readings with some sort of spiritual overload or something. You wait and listen. You wait for what's emerging in the person's life. You don't try and create this overlay narrative. At least I don't. So I think they blend together beautifully.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so what is your third pick for the island?
Well, I had to put in Pluto, the Evolutionary Journey of the Soul by Liz Greene, because when I picked it out of a shop in Glastonbury in my mid-20s and just read my Pluto placement, it had a big impact on me. And then I put it back on the bookshelf and walked out. No, maybe I got it. No, maybe I got it. Maybe I did buy it. But I certainly read the whole chapter before I was sure I would. Just stood in the bookstore.
Yeah.
And then I read it later. And then I had the fortune to study with Greene through a strange series of circumstances. The only time he ever taught in London. And I was
didn't know that. Wow.
Yes, 1999 in London. And I am the only person that graduated from that mini school, other than some of the people that traveled with him who had already studied in other locations, because a bunch of sort of British, slightly formal astrologers, one guy was in a suit in this posh lounge area in this nice, well-to-do London neighborhood, had this guy in a dirty white t-shirt, jeans and cowboy boots come straight off the plane to the classroom, chewing nicotine gum. Yeah, exactly. Well, and to say he made an impact would be an understatement. He was a somewhat unstable person sometimes, and he wasn't always the most generous teacher in terms of people were frightened to ask him questions, but they were also partly frightened because they sensed he was a genuine visionary, and he was. So at his best, he was clearly a visionary. The Pluto book is a strange read for some people's tastes. It's certainly not written well in a classical sense. It's a highly intuitive read. But I had to pick it because I had to honor that although I was an interesting young man, I'd studied all these different traditions and I had these genuine spiritual teachers or experiences in my past. The sense of how astrology fitted in with that had not really profoundly come together until I met Greene at 27, 28, when he had this massive impact on me. And I realized the way he's describing the psychological aspects of these archetypes and even the spiritual aspects of them is helping me bring all this stuff together. Your Liz Greene, Sportas, Soraya on one side, and Kabbalah and mysticism and theosophy and what have you on the other. And here's this ground where they powerfully come together. Not those traditions necessarily, just a direct language of seeing the archetypes as psychologically intense and real and spiritually purposeful. And that was his great thing. And I feel very fortunate. It was one of those life-changing encounters to be that young and work in close quarters. I had no other involvement with him. People sometimes, I think, mistook in the past that he was somehow mentoring me in between or something. Nope. It was just, a week class, a 6-month gap, a week class. That was it.
Wow.
But it was life-changing. And I spent the next 2 or 3 years working on what he'd presented and trying to fill in the gaps. And I did write to the organization. I got manuscripts sent me and stuff like that, because I realized that what he was teaching was a visionary orientation towards it. But there was a method buried somewhere, but it took me a long time to work that out. It's not like the method was presented in a clear way. So, but I mean, hats off to the guy. He was truly inspirational and, in a way, helped set me on a course. So I'm in my early 30s, and a few years later, I've got a private practice in Bristol. I'm seeing clients as a kind of spiritual psychotherapist. And the whole time I'm working on this deeper orientation. I've already taught schools by then. So when I graduated, I finally got so good at it that Greene loved my work and asked me to teach the schools in the UK under his type of approach in the early 2000s. So this was this incredibly immersive experience for me to go straight into a big teaching environment, like week-long classes. So it was very, very useful to my development. I met some incredible people and really began to trust that looking at charts like that had this incredible power to touch people, because I was doing it with people and that's how they were responding. So that's very validating, isn't it?
Yeah. If I can make a rough analogy, what I'm hearing from you now and appreciating in your work is that what Ruperti did for Rudhyar, Mark Jones has done for Jeff Greene.
Well, I felt that I was then in my therapy practice and in certain principles of psychotherapy, sifting through Greene's legacy and literally picking out the best and brightest bits, which were genuinely inspirational, and perhaps softening or even letting go altogether of some of the more, what I felt were like superstitious, or, Greene could come off like a biblical prophet sometimes, and I think we have to be cautious about that personally, because the chances that any one subjective entity could understand reality on that level, even an inspired one, to the greatest level, would be very low, to me. I do think that's where we have to come back to a community or an organizational principle that helps us bring out the best of all of it. I think occasionally Greene was just a bit too isolated as a figure, isolated in his own visionary, intuitive space, but that can create a distance between a person and the world.
Not transpersonal enough?
I think he was so transpersonal, but there were personal wounds or something like that. I say that without judgment. I mean, I feel this, this is not an easy life to navigate, is there? And I think some part of Greene was so highly developed. His intuition was so highly developed. It probably actually became hard to live with in a certain kind of way. But yeah, massive respect to the guy, massive respect to all these people. In some ways, in choosing these books for you, Jenn, it allows you to recollect what shaped you effectively.
And also transmit that to everyone listening, which I think is a beautiful thing to share. So if you have actually had beginners, but if currently, right now, if someone comes up to you and says, Mark, will you teach me astrology? You say, yes, but first read this and then come back. What is the book you're putting in their hand?
I mean, I really like that Charles and Susie Harvey book, Principles of Astrology. I don't know if it's even in print still, but it's just so elegantly clear. It's not trying to do too much. And yet what it does try to do, there's this fantastic page where it explores Mars, for example. The whole page is just like from the most like surgery fighting all the way to the sword of discrimination, or I was thinking almost like Manjushri kind of levels or something. But anyway, it doesn't say Manjushri, but you know what I mean? It was just doing this whole range. And I was appreciative that in a beginner's book, they would take this effort to show these different levels in this very clear written style. So I do like that. I do think Stephen Forrest with The Inner Sky created a very accessible, very thoughtful book for the more psychological, religious or spiritually type interested person that's not too highfalutin, not too fancy. And then, of course, we're seeing this increasing proliferation in our era, aren't we? Where we go beyond the book, where there's just so many classes now, podcasts or different study programs. And of course, that's a very interesting and exciting area, isn't it? Are we going through another revolution? I mean, I've argued this for years that, the Gutenberg printing press was the great change from a pre-existing oral culture to a written culture that's dominated the last few centuries, since the 17th century or something, 16th, 17th. And then, you could argue late 20th century into 21st, we're making a true transition to a visual culture. It started with television and what have you, but at this
I'd
point,
go earlier in cinema
yeah,
and film.
yeah, good point. But you still had this sense that books were still parallel important, just like, I guess, photography and painting or something.
Sure, yeah.
You know, they were both meaningful, but we're going into an era where even the bibliophiles read less and listen to podcasts or other things as part of that energy that they would have used to read.
Which is so meta because we're recording a podcast about books while I'm sitting in a library full of books. Bypassing the need to read the books because they're going to just get the cocktail version of Mark Jones's take and go and tell people about.
Well, and you can see that is powerful, isn't it? And more people will get into it. I must acknowledge it myself. There are areas now where I'm researching for presentation where I will watch the author do a detailed long format podcast about their thesis or about their book, and an hour of that will be enough rather than reading the book. And I'm quite a quick reader, and let's say it's an interesting book on social psychology, I could probably read that in 4 to 6 hours, even a few hundred pages, 3 to 5 hours even maybe. But that's a very high quality of attention to read at that pace and take it in. It's using up my energy a lot. And a 1 hour podcast can replace it at still a relatively deep level. I mean, it's a tremendous gift. We just have to be careful, don't we? Because reading books is not just about gaining information. It's about following a track of thought. It's about recreating with the author an inner world in which we stay in relationship to what they were thinking. We don't want to lose out on that quality altogether because there's something very profound about that as a contemplative path.
Well, and also thinking about interpersonal and communal concepts. When one of my favorite things about being in this space at CAELi is that when I read a citation, even just the other day, I was reading through the math issue of the NCGR journal because, that's what you do, right? You're like, let me get into this house systems math. And they made a note saying there's another house system that was created in the 20th century, and it's on page 46 and 47 of this New Weights Compendium by Colin Evans. So I just got to walk across the room and pick the book up. And I looked at page 46 and 47 and read it from the horse's mouth. And it was such a neat thing to be able to just get up, go find the thing, look at the page, read the source from its own straight transmission, and then return back to the journal. And it was like, that's how it should be.
And we don't want to lose that, do we? And we might have to recognize that certain specialist institutions or specialized individuals, I mean, we were talking before we came on air, so to speak. I live here in South Wales and I'm close, maybe less than 10 minutes drive from Philip Graves and, a world-class astrological library. You're there with your institute and a growing library. We need these cultural nodes, these points that preserve certain things, because it is important to be able to go back and look at the original. Because frankly, at a certain point, all these interpretive layers become suspect, don't they? And, there's been a huge issue in the world about fact checking because it's not a simple thing, right? Because there isn't just simple facts anymore. Is this the great Pluto Aquarius struggle? The fight for reality and itself, that, facts aren't simple because they themselves participate in networks of meaning. But it is important every now and then, instead of just accepting one person's take that becomes very influential on a series of things, that we go back to the original things and check nothing was left behind,
Sure. Absolutely. All right. So what are you up to these days and where can people find you?
You can find me on markjonesastrology.com. So I mix my time between doing readings for people, doing ongoing mentoring for people. I've created a spiritual psychology coaching training since COVID happened, over 100 hours of video content training over a longer period of time. And then my friend and colleague, fellow psychosynthesis trained, who went to the archive with me in Florence in 2012, he teaches the supervision mentoring groups. So that's a very purposeful thing to be engaged in, training people, many of whom are astrologers, not all, to become psychological, spiritually orientated coaches, guides for people. And then, regular teaching for Astrology University, a variety of schools in China and other places. But really, with my researcher, building up some new quality material, including an idea of doing a more general astrology course, frankly. I mean, maybe this is too much to commit to something that we haven't even started yet, but we've built all this background information for a series of parts of something like how to be an effective astrologer. You know, literally looking at everything from counseling dynamics to hemisphere emphasis to sun-moon dynamics and what's really going on, to the simple progression techniques, just the whole shebang, our take, you know, something rich in that regard. So we'll see on that front, because, you know, I'm very committed to my work, but as you well know, young family, various things, there's lots of other things going on too. But isn't it a joy, Jen, to be doing, you know, we've known each other a few years, had occasions of decent chats and a nice drink or two together. It's just great to be doing all of that, isn't it? Living life, being real, being a parent, and then doing the work we love and building something in this great community that we're in, really. A community that's brought together people like you and I, who would have never have known each other.
Correct.
If we weren't in this strange, amazing community. So, I mean, that's also very Aquarian too, isn't it? That these subgroups become actual networks. They become actual substantive foundations.
Yeah. Beautifully put. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy life to share your mind and thoughts and book choices with us.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me, Jen, and let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.